All right, folks, buckle up because today we're diving headfirst into one of the most explosive stories shaking the auto world right now. Trump's tariffs crush GM and Ford, factories flee to Canada. Yeah, you heard that right. Tariffs are wreaking havoc, profits are tanking, and the entire North American auto empire is on the brink of a massive shakeup. I'm your host, Steve, and in this commentary video, we're not just skimming the surface. We're going deep, unpacking every juicy detail with real facts from trusted sources like Al Jazeera, CBC News, Forbes, Auto News, and more. No fluff, no fake news, just hard-hitting analysis to keep you glued to your screen. If you're into politics, economics, or just love cars, this is the breakdown you've been waiting for. Let's rev those engines and get started. First off, let's set the stage. It's December 2025, and President Donald Trump's second term is in full swing. Back in March, he dropped the hammer with 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, citing threats from illegal immigration and drugs pouring over the borders. But here's the kicker. These aren't just any tariffs. They're laser-focused on goods like autos, steel, aluminum, and parts that keep Detroit humming. According to Auto Week's deep dive on the USMCA, the trade deal that replaced NAFTA in 2020, these tariffs initially hit hard, but then Trump threw in a temporary exemption for products that comply with USMCA rules. That means if a car or part has at least 75% North American content, it might skate by without the full 25% slap. But for non-compliant stuff, boom, prices skyrocket, supply chains grind to a halt, and companies like GM and Ford are left scrambling. Auto Week explains that this creates massive uncertainty. The auto industry prefers retaining the trilateral USMCA structure for stability, though it can adapt to rules, but not easily to uncertainty and overlapping rulebooks. Imagine trying to build a puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape. That's the chaos we're talking about. Now, why does this matter for the auto giants? Let's zoom in on the big picture. The North American auto industry is a beast, producing millions of vehicles a year, with parts crisscrossing borders like a high-stakes game of hot potato. In 2024 alone, Canada churned out 1.3 million vehicles, with over 1 million heading straight to the US per Canadian auto dealer. But Trump's tariffs, they're like throwing sand in the gears. Experts from Brookings Institution, in their May 2025 report on the impact of US tariffs on North American auto manufacturing, warn that these duties will disrupt trade and investment, especially in autos, leading to higher costs and potential reshoring of production. They outline how tariffs affect everything from finished cars to raw materials, forcing companies to rethink where they build stuff. And folks, this isn't hypothetical. It's happening now with real dollars and jobs on the line. Take General Motors, for instance. Al Jazeera's July 22, 2025 article screams the headline, "General Motors profit drops 35% as Trump tariffs hit car industry." They report GM's second quarter profits plummeted 35.4% to $1.9 billion, with revenues down 1.8% to $47.1 billion. A whopping $1.1 billion of that drop, directly from tariffs on imported cars, steel, aluminum, and parts from Mexico, Canada, and even South Korea. GM's CFO, Paul Jacobson, didn't mince words. "We haven't made any long-term decisions about Korea yet, mainly because there is a lot of uncertainty about that." He added that the first quarter hit was the peak, but profits in the second half of 2025 would still suffer from seasonally lower volumes and ongoing tariff whacks. Despite this, GM stuck to their full-year forecast of $10 billion to $12.5 billion in operating income. But here's where it gets interesting. GM isn't just sitting on their hands. They're pumping $4 billion over 2 years into U.S. plants in Michigan, Kansas, and Tennessee to expand production and shift models like the Chevrolet Equinox and Blazer from Mexico to the States. Jacobson says it'll take 18 to 24 months for these footprint adjustments, but it's a clear sign. Tariffs are pushing production back home, not fleeing elsewhere, 2025, but predicts profitability by 2029. Shares ticked up 1% after hours, but that's cold comfort. Production-wise, their Tennessee factory flips from EVs to gas trucks in 2029, and battery plants in Kentucky face layoffs as Ford takes solo ownership. Andrew Frick, Ford's ops head, says, rather than spending billions more on large EVs that now have no path to profitability, we are allocating that money into higher returning areas. Broader impacts? GM took a $1.6 billion charge for EV adjustments. Stellantis axed an electric Ram. Everyone's pivoting back to gas and hybrids, leaving Tesla with scraps in a shrinking market. But wait, is there any silver lining? Al Jazeera notes a surge in spring demand as consumers rushed to buy before tariffs jacked up prices, boosting GM's truck and SUV sales. Still, the pain is real. Stellantis, their rival, reported a $2.7 billion loss in the first half of 2025, blaming tariffs too. This isn't isolated, it's an industry-wide quake. Forbes's March 4, 2025 piece on tariffs, winners and losers in the auto industry lists GM, Ford and Stellantis as top losers. Why? They produced hundreds of thousands of vehicles in Mexico last year. GM alone did 889,072, or 22.3% of their total. Tariffs hike costs, disrupt supply chains, and tank stocks. GM's shares dropped 4.6% in pre-market after the announcements. Forbes argues these companies can't pivot quickly. Supply chains cannot change quickly, and shifting to domestic suppliers may raise prices due to increased demand, leading to a standstill. It's like trying to turn a supertanker on a dime, impossible without waves crashing everywhere. Shifting gears to Ford, CBC News, December 16, 2025, report on Ford retreats from EVs and takes big financial hit as Trump policies grip industry, paints a grim picture. Ford's announcing a massive $19.5 billion write-down through 2027, ditching pure EVs in favor of hybrids and gas guzzlers. Why? Trump's policies killed the $7,500 EV tax credit in September, eased emissions rules, and froze fuel economy fines, tanking EV sales by 40% in November. Ford CEO Jim Farley calls it a market change over the last couple of months that forced their hand. They're scrapping the next-gen T3 electric truck and electric vans, opting for an extended-range F-150 Lightning with a gas engine backup. By 2030, they aim for 50% of sales in hybrids and EVs, up from 17%, with affordable models starting at $30,000, like a mid-size EV truck in Louisville by 2027. Financially, it's brutal. $8.5 billion to cancel EV models, $6 billion to dissolve a battery JV with SK On, and $5 billion in program costs. Ford expects $5 billion EV losses in both 20... Now, let's talk Canada, the elephant in the room. Canadian auto dealers, March 28, 2025, article on Canadian auto industry reacts to Trump's 25% auto tariffs, shows panic mode. Ford, GM, and Stellantis CEOs begged Trump to back off, warning of crippled operations from cross-border parts. Analyst Darren Slind predicts massive disruption, with vehicle prices up $3,000 to $10,000, sales drops, and long-term shifts to U.S. production or automation. Sean McTavish from AutoZen fears temporary closures for Stellantis and Honda plants. Ontario Premier Doug Ford called it Termination Day for American workers, while PM Mark Carney labelled it a direct attack, rolling out a $2 billion fund to shield the supply chain. Retaliation? Canada slapped 25% tariffs on U.S. goods, starting with $30 billion worth. But are factories fleeing to Canada? Hold up, the data says the opposite. The New York Times, October 15, 2025, piece on In Nod to Trump, automaker Stellantis shifts production from Canada to U.S., reveals Stellantis moving SUV production from Brampton, Ontario to Illinois. Trump himself brags about bringing jobs back. Supply Chain Dive's recent recap on tariffs, strikes and tragedies, how 2025 transformed supply chains, notes ongoing adjustments and uncertainty, spurring shifts amid threats. Auto Industry's Michigan Alliance report from March echoes 25% tariffs will hit hard, pushing reshoring. This tariff saga is more than numbers. It's about livelihoods. Imagine assembly line workers in Windsor, Ontario, staring at pink slips because a part from across the border now costs 25% more. Or Detroit families facing $10,000 hikes on a new F-150. Trump's goal? Bring manufacturing home, boost U.S. jobs. But at what cost? Consumer confidence plunged in February, per Forbes, the biggest drop since 2021, slamming new car sales. Used cars might boom, sales up modestly in 2024. But tariffs could supercharge that as new prices soar. And don't forget the ripple effects. Auto News crowns the trade war as 2025's top story. President Donald Trump landed a 1-2 punch on the auto industry. CBC's Windsor report on border warehouses describes administrative nightmares, from tariffs turning paperwork into chaos. Manufacturing Dive's year-end numbers project trillions in tariff revenue, but warn of retaliation and economic drags. In my commentary, this feels like a high-stakes poker game where Trump's bluffing with American jobs. Sure, exemptions help USMCA compliant stuff, but the uncertainty, killer. GM's optimistic October lift in forecast to 12 to 13 billion profit per The Guardian shows some adaptation, but Q2's 1.1 billion hit lingers. Ford's EV pivot, smart, but $19.5 billion write-down screams pain. We're just scratching the surface here, folks. Tariffs aren't just policy. They're reshaping an industry worth billions, affecting everything from your grocery bill, higher transport costs, to global relations. Canada and Mexico aren't backing down. Mexico's upping tariffs on Chinese imports to 50% per auto week to curb reliance. All right, we're charging full speed into the auto apocalypse unfolding under Trump's tariffs. If you thought the intro was intense, hold on. Now we're zeroing in on General Motors, the Detroit giant that's taken the hardest punches so far. We're talking billions in losses, profit plunges, and strategic shifts that are reshaping the entire industry, all backed by rock-solid sources like Reuters, CNBC, the New York Times, Al Jazeera, and AP News. No speculation, just the raw facts that make this story explode. Let's dissect GM's pain point by point, because this is where the tariff war gets real personal for workers, investors, and anyone buying a truck or SUV. First, let's hit the headline numbers that had Wall Street reeling. In July 2025, Reuters reported that Trump's tariffs took a staggering $1.1 billion bite out of GM's second quarter earnings. Profits dropped 35% to $1.9 billion, with revenues dipping 1.8% to $47.1 billion. Al Jazeera echoed this on July 22nd, calling it a 35% drop in second quarter profits, directly tied to tariffs on vehicles, steel, aluminum, and parts from Mexico, Canada, and South Korea. Minimal offsets early on, and warned the second half of the year would feel even worse due to seasonal dips and back-to-back quarters of tariff pain. But GM stuck to its full-year forecast of $10 to $12.5 billion in operating income, showing resilience or maybe just stubborn hope. Why is GM getting crushed harder than rivals? Exposure, folks, pure and simple. CNBC in March 2025 explained that GM imports about half the vehicles it sells in the US, far more than Ford's 20 to 22% or Stellantis mix. Wolf Research and Deutsche Bank analysts pointed out GM's heavy reliance on Mexico for profitable trucks and lower-priced EVs. JP Morgan noted GM sources around 40% of US sold vehicles from Mexico and Canada. That's why shares tanked 7 to 8% on tariff announcements per AP News and CNBC, while Ford and Stellantis dipped less. Bloomberg in May 2025 sized up the broader cost. Tariffs could wipe out profits for Detroit's Big Three if sustained. But GM isn't rolling over. They're fighting back with massive U.S. investments. The New York Times in July reported CEO Mary Barra announcing $4 billion over 2 years to ramp up production in Michigan, Kansas, and Tennessee plants. This includes shifting models like the Chevrolet Equinox and Blazer from Mexico to U.S. lines, aiming to dodge future tariff hits. Bloomberg in June detailed how this reduces Mexican output while boosting domestic trucks, Silverado and Sierra production moving stateside. Reuters in April noted GM increasing light-duty truck output in Fort Wayne, Indiana, directly responding to tariffs. Barra told investors GM has capacity in the United States to shift some of that from Mexico and Canada. Result: potential 3,000 to 4,000 new U.S. jobs per company spokespeople. Fast forward to October 2025, and things brighten a bit. Reuters on October 21st said GM raised its full-year profit forecast to $12 to $13 billion, citing lower-than-expected tariff impacts, down to $3.5 to $4.5 billion from the earlier $4 to $5 billion scare. The Guardian confirmed this, with Barra noting mitigation of 35% through self-help, like cost cuts and supply tweaks. Lighter EV losses helped too, as GM unwound some overambitious bets amid weakening demand. Shares surged 15% on the news, lifting Ford and Stellantis too. But don't celebrate yet. Earlier in May, AP News reported GM slashing guidance by 20% to account for up to $5 billion in tariffs, dropping EBIT expectations from the human cost. Layoffs and idles ripple across borders. While GM adds U.S. jobs long-term, short-term pain hits North America. NPR in July noted tariffs reduced GM's profit margin from 9% to 6.1%. Broader industry warnings from Wells Fargo via CNBC estimated collective Detroit hits at $56 billion at full 25% levels. GM's playbook: expedite U.S. shipments pre-tariffs, fix pricing on metals, and sourcing more domestically. Compared to rivals, Ford's Jim Farley called tariffs chaos in February per CNBC, but Ford's lower import reliance shielded it better. Trump even bragged in October via Reuters that GM and Ford CEOs thanked him for truck tariffs, claiming stocks soared. Reality? Mixed. Tariffs push reshoring, but at huge upfront cost. For consumers, this means higher prices. Analysts like Barclays warned of $3,000 to $10,000 per vehicle ads per Fortune and Detroit Free Press. GM's Jacobson said expect 0.5 to 1% overall price hikes in 2025. Used cars might boom as new ones soar. Zoom out. Trump's goal, bring jobs home, is partially working for GM. Shifts from Mexico/Canada to U.S. plants align with his vision. But Brookings in May warned of disrupted investment and higher costs continent-wide. Canadian plants feel the squeeze, less production there as tariffs make exports pricey. GM's story is a microcosm of the tariff war. Pain now, potential gains later, if they adapt fast. Barra's letter to shareholders emphasized nimbleness and dialogue with the administration, but with ongoing uncertainty, steel/aluminum tariffs, retaliatory moves from Canada, it's a high-wire act. As we close this GM deep dive, ask yourself, is this the price of America first, or a boomerang hurting everyone? Profits tanked, but U.S. factories are gearing up, winners and losers emerging fast. We've shredded the big picture and GM's brutal hits. Now it's time to turn the spotlight on Ford Motor Company, the blue oval that's been navigating this tariff storm with a mix of pain, pivots, and some unexpected wins. Ford's story is wild, massive write-downs, a dramatic retreat from pure EVs, hybrid surges, and CEO Jim Farley straight up calling the chaos while thanking Trump in the same breath. We're pulling no punches here, starting with the bombshell that dropped in mid-December 2025. Ford announced a jaw-dropping $19.5 billion write-down, the biggest EV bust in Detroit history, per the Wall Street Journal via Forbes. Reuters on December 15th broke it down. $8.5 billion to cancel planned pure EV models, $6 billion to dissolve a battery joint venture with South Korea's SK On, and $5 billion in program-related expenses. This wasn't just accounting cleanup. It was Ford slamming the brakes on an aggressive EV push that had already burned billions. CEO Jim Farley framed it as a customer-driven pivot, ditching pure EVs like the next-gen T3 electric truck and electric vans, scrapping the full electric F-150 Lightning production, though an extended range version with gas backup is coming, and flipping factories like Tennessee from EVs to gas trucks in 2029. By 2030, Ford aims for 50% of sales in hybrids, extended range EVs, and pure EVs, up from 17% now. Shares ticked up slightly after hours, but this $19.5 billion charge screams the tariff-era reality check. Why the massive retreat? Trump's policies killed the $7,500 federal EV tax credit in September 2025, eased emissions rules, and froze fuel economy fines, tanking pure EV demand by 40% in November alone, per CBC News earlier reports echoed in recent coverage. Farley told CNBC the EV market shrunk to around 5% share, way smaller than the 10 to 12% projected. Fortune quoted him saying ending the credit was a game changer, forcing Ford to follow customers to hybrids and gas where profitability is clearer. Model E losses piled up. $4.7 billion in 2023, $5.1 billion in 2024, $3.6 billion in the first 3 quarters of 2025, totaling over $15 billion before this write-down. Layoffs hit Kentucky battery plants short-term as Ford took full ownership, but Farley promised thousands of new jobs long-term in gas and hybrid lines. But tariffs? They're the undercurrent amplifying everything. Ford's lower import exposure, producing about 80% of U.S. sold vehicles domestically, per Reuters July reports, shielded it better than GM initially. Yet, parts from Canada, Mexico, and steel aluminum hits added up. Reuters in July 2025 said Ford raised its projected tariff hit, expecting a gross $3 billion impact, but offsetting $1 billion through mitigations. CNBC in February had Farley calling tariffs chaos, adding a lot of cost alongside threats. Gross hit climbed, but by October, relief came. Reuters reported Trump expanding credits for U.S. production, easing part tariffs. Ford closed up 3.7% on the news. Farley publicly thanked Trump, saying the order helps make parts affordable for U.S. builders. Financially, Ford's been a roller coaster. Q3 2025 revenue hit record $50.5 billion, adjusted EBIT $2.6 billion, beating expectations despite tariffs and EV drags per Fortune October coverage. But full-year guidance cut to $6 to $6.5 billion EBIT due to supply disruptions like the Novelis aluminum fire. Tariffs contributed approximately $700 million quarterly burden in Q3, but net 2025 hit dropped to approximately $1 billion, thanks to policy tweaks rewarding domestic content. Raised 2025 EBIT to $7 billion in December amid the pivot, underlying strength in Ford Pro commercials, trucks, and hybrids shining through. Production shifts? Like GM, Ford's leaning US heavy. No major fleeing to Canada. Tariffs make exporting from there pricier. Instead, incentives push reshoring, higher US truck output, hybrid expansions. Bloomberg in May noted Trump's bet on tariffs bringing manufacturing home, partially working, with Ford reallocating capital from EVs to higher return gas-charged hybrids. Consumer side, prices up, but Ford held firm longer than rivals. Analysts like Barclays, via earlier reports, warned 3,000 to 10,000 vehicle hikes industry-wide. Ford absorbed much early, but passed some on. EV pivot means more affordable hybrids, approximately $30,000 mid-size truck by 2027, potentially stabilizing prices as gas demand rebounds. Broader chaos. Entry tariffs from Canada hit U.S. exports. Mexico adjusted. Supply chain dive recaps 2025 as transformed by tariffs, strikes, tragedies, forcing resilience. Ford's Tennessee flip, Kentucky adjustments, all tariff-influenced. In commentary mode, Ford's playing smart poker here. Farley called the EV bubble early, pivoted hard, risky with $19.5 billion pain, but positions for profitability in a post-subsidy world. Trump's tariffs hurt short-term, but align with Farley's America First build strategy. Stocks volatile, but hybrid boom could pay off huge. Ford's chapter shows adaptation amid apocalypse, painful write-downs, but emerging stronger, or just delaying the inevitable EV shift. If you've been with me from the start, you know GM and Ford are bleeding billions, but Stellantis? They're the wild card getting hammered hardest, with plant shutdowns, massive losses, and a desperate scramble to survive. We're backing every claim with ironclad sources like Reuters, the New York Times, AP News, Fortune, and Auto News. No filler, just the explosive details that'll have you rethinking your next car purchase. Let's crank this up and expose how tariffs are redrawing the map of North American auto production. First, let's zero in on Stellantis, the Franco-Italian giant behind Jeep, Dodge, Ram, and Chrysler. They're getting absolutely pulverized by Trump's 25% tariffs, more than GM or Ford combined. Reuters in April 2025 reported Stellantis idling its Windsor, Ontario minivan plant for 2 weeks starting April 7th, directly blaming the tariffs for supply chain snarls and higher costs. This wasn't a one-off. Production cuts rippled across North America, leading to 900 temporary layoffs in the U.S., including at Michigan plants feeding Windsor. CEO Carlos Tavares called it a direct response to the trade environment, per AP News on April 3rd. Then came the bombshell. Stellantis posted a staggering $2.7 billion net loss in the first half of 2025, the worst in years, as tariffs piled on top of weak demand and high inventories. Reuters on July 23rd detailed how tariffs on parts from Mexico and Canada added hundreds of millions in costs, forcing price hikes and sales slumps. Shares plunged 10% on the news. Investors were furious. But Stellantis didn't stop there. They made a bold move that Trump himself bragged about. The New York Times on October 15, 2025, headlined, "In nod to Trump, automaker Stellantis shifts production from Canada to US. They're moving assembly of the Dodge Hornet and Alfa Romeo Tonale SUVs from Brampton, Ontario to Belvidere, Illinois, a shuttered plant they're reopening with $5 billion in investments. This creates 1,500 US jobs by 2027, directly dodging tariffs on Canadian exports." Trump posted on Truth Social, "Great news, Tariffs confirmed it was tariff-driven. The uncertainty in trade policies made it unsustainable to keep building in Canada for the US market." AP News echoed this, noting the shift starts in 2027, with Brampton retooling for future models but losing volume short-term. Why is Stellantis hit so hard? Exposure. They produce tons in Mexico, like the Ram 1500 at Saltillo, and Canada, Jeeps in Windsor, with 40% of US sales imported. Fortune in March 2025 listed them as a top loser. Tariffs could add $2,000 to $4,000 per vehicle, eroding their slim margins. Unlike Ford's domestic strength, Stellantis relies on cross-border flows. Tariffs disrupt that like a wrecking ball. Broader pain. Reuters in May reported temporary U.S. furloughs at Kokomo, Indiana, transmissions for Windsor, and Toluca, Mexico, Jeeps. Overall, 2,450 workers idled across North America in April alone. Now, let's bust the big myth in your video title. Are factories really fleeing to Canada? Spoiler, absolutely not. It's the exact opposite. All evidence shows production shifting from Canada and Mexico to the U.S. to avoid tariffs. The New York Times October piece confirms Stellantis' move as a direct response to Trump's tariffs, bringing jobs south of the border. Auto News in November 2025 recapped, "Tariffs spur reshoring. Stellantis, GM, Ford all boosting U.S. capacity." Canadian auto dealer in March warned Ontario plants face existential threat, with up to 50,000 jobs at risk if exports tank. Premier Doug Ford's Termination Day quip. Spot on. Canadian outputs dropping as companies like Honda pause expansions in Alliston, Ontario, per Reuters. Foreign players are scrambling too. Toyota and Honda, with huge Canadian footprints, are rethinking everything. Reuters in May reported Toyota idling Cambridge, Ontario, lines for Corollas due to tariff uncertainty on parts. Honda's shifting some Civic production from Alliston to Indiana, another U.S. win. Volkswagen's considering pausing Mexican builds for U.S. exports. Fortune's March analysis. Foreign firms hit hardest since they lack U.S. leverage. Tariffs could add $5,000 plus per vehicle, pushing prices up 10%. Bloomberg in June noted Toyota's $13.9 billion U.S. investment plan, accelerating to counter tariffs, building more in Kentucky and Mississippi. Winners and losers? Losers, consumers, prices up $3,000 to $10,000 industry-wide per Detroit Free Press and Barclays analysts. Workers in Canada, Mexico facing layoffs, thousands already. Big Three profits. GM down 35%, Stellantis in the red. Ford's $19.5 billion write-down. Tesla, quiet winner. Domestic production dodges tariffs. EV sales holding as rivals retreat. U.S. steel, aluminum firms booming from protected markets. Trump claims victory. Jobs returning. Manufacturing. Final verdict, not apocalypse. It's a high-stakes reset. Trump's playing hardball and Detroit's rising to the challenge. Whether you're cheering America first or worried about your next car payment, One thing's clear, this tariff war reshaped the auto world forever. There it is, folks, the full, no-holds-barred breakdown. If this fired you up, smash that like button, drop your hottest take in the comments. Genius move or self-inflicted wound? Subscribe for more deep analytics on politics and economics. We're just getting started. Thanks for riding this marathon with me. Stay informed, stay savage, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace out.